Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to join you, hopefully with something that will bring you a little bit beyond your comfort zone. On my end, first of all, a caveat. It's difficult to compete with you guys in terms of visual stuff, so don't take this PowerPoint presentation as an aesthetic object. It's just a very humble, very, very low-key support for what I am about to say. So thank you very much, and I hope you'll see connections with what you do, and you'll have questions about many of these words that seem altogether a little bit overwhelming, but we will unpack all of them for you, okay? So without further ado, thank you. In his 1772 seminal work, Physiognomy, or the corresponding analogy between the conformation of the features and the ruling passions of the mind, very long title, the main promoter of physiognomy in modern times, namely the Swiss poet and philosopher Johann Caspar Lavater, discusses what for him is, quote, the most natural, manly, useful, noble, apparently easy, while in fact the most difficult of the arts, namely portrait painting. Lavater supports its foundational role in both creative activity and scientific inquiry as a means of communication and preservation of the image of some individual. And he validates his thoughts with an alleged quotation from his friend Goethe that says, the best text for a commentary on man is his presence, his countenance, his form. Fast forward, and also with our slide here, fast forward more than 100 years, this passage curiously reappears in French at the opening of the first chapter of Fisionomia e Mimica, so physiognomy and expression, literally, by Italian anthropologist Luigi Cerchiari. You see it in the little section under the title, La présence de l'homme, son visage, sa physionomie, est le meilleur texte de tout ce qu'on peut dire de lui. So the French version of the same quote by Goethe. Besides demonstrating the closely woven intertextual network across space and time that keeps together these and numerous other seminal studies on this discipline, physiognomy, that enjoyed intense but quite short-lived popularity, what seems to captivate scholars in this Goethean resonance is the emphasis on the face as a semiotic device, metonymically standing for the discipline as a whole, as Lavater declares. Physiognomy, he says, is reading the handwriting of nature upon the human countenance. However, with his unequaled cynicism, the French novelist Gustave Flaubert had already taken it upon himself to expose the effects of taking literally the deterministic equivalence of physical and moral traits that physiognomy aims to validate. The provocative dictionary of received ideas that closes his novel Bouvard et Pécuchet, 1881, inflicts a blow to the stereotypical connotation of face as mirror of the soul. He adds sarcastically, in which case some people's souls are mightily ugly. This is indeed an abrupt reawakening from the torpor of commonplaces that seem harmless when adopted acritically, but bearers of painful truths if seriously taken verbatim. With my talk, I do not aim to endorse in toto what art historian Ernest Gombrich defined as physiognomical fallacy for its own sake. Rather, I wish to step into the European intellectual discourse of the turn of the 19th century, the so-called fin de siècle, and allow these tensions to emerge even in the heyday of physiognomy, as productive inconsistencies able to offer a more critical and complex perspective on the construction of an individual and collective subject. In the age of scientific positivism and aesthetic naturalism and realism, both looking for regularities that are detectable through observable empirical evidence and need to be investigated with rational strategies, physiognomy offers an intriguing and visually effective example of a system of conceptualizations, discourses, and practices that represent the body as the object of normative inscriptions expressing non-negotiable physical, aesthetic, and moral truths. In other words, I argue, physiognomy assists in what has come to be known as biopolitics. Biopolitics, as the term suggests, combines life, in the Greek prefix bios, with politics in the sense of the practices and actions that influence, guide, control the complex of relations between people living in a society. We owe this concept mainly to French intellectual Michel Foucault, who introduced the term in the 1970s to investigate the strategies and mechanisms adopted by regimes of authority to manage human life through a blend of knowledge and power. Modern power, for Foucault, is characterized by a fundamentally different rationality than that of sovereign power. It is no longer a matter of right over individuals' life and death, but rather of biopower, as he says, which intervenes upon vital aspects of human life, such as the production of knowledge, the generation of truth discourses about life, and the modes through which individuals construct subjectivities between a sense of self and the collective. Why are the notions of biopolitics and biopower important for us in our framework tonight? Because the scientific discourse in 19th century Europe, with its emerging natural history of man, of which physiognomy is a pivotal tool, reinforces precisely this productive notion of power through the development of techniques that operate in and on the individual body as apparatuses of discipline for the purpose of governance and productivity. And biopolitics treats the population in both scientific and political terms, aiming, as Foucault says, not at man as body, but as man as species. And I can give you a longer quotation from Foucault to give you an idea of why also the 19th century is a privileged moment when, according to Foucault, these technologies of regulation develop and have a repercussion on the subject, both at the individual and at the collective level. My purpose tonight is to highlight some ruptures in this alleged biopolitical framework by focusing on European intellectuals who, intentionally or unwittingly, and this is important because sometimes it's not a deliberate intent, but it's something that emerges from their own doctrines despite their official intention. So what do? They recodify the descriptive, but in fact prescriptive laws of physiognomy, redefining the boundaries of the body, of matter, of nature, and of the subject. I will examine what I would call three representative physiognomies of excess. First, variability of expressions and states of excitation. Second, tattooing. Third, crowd behavior. And let's see what binds them together. In the preface of his 1883 volume Fisionomia e Mimica, Physiognomy and Expression, Paolo Mantegazza, the father of Italian anthropology, maintains that, quote, the human face interests all because it is a book in which everybody feels the need to read every day and every hour of life. Predictably, it inspires a veritable universal cult, as, he says, it is in the face that we find assembled in a small space the five senses and so many nerves and muscles so mobile that they form one of the most expressive pictures of human nature. Even without speaking, through our face we express all the desires and all the fears, all the multiform life that gushes from the archway of that supreme organ that is our brain. At the same time, Mantegazza undermines faith in physiognomy as an exact science and foregrounds instead what he defines as the general laws that govern expression in the animal world. So you begin to see a difference between physiognomy and expression, and we'll see in what way this is deployed not only in Mantegazza but in other thinkers. In other words, he privileges not so much static, regular, permanent facial features, but rather mimica, so expression, as the recording of transitory feelings and emotions. Yet, as I hope to show, his standpoint remains ambivalent, and thus, for me at least, all the more intriguing, and we'll see why. On the side of tradition, in the footsteps of his model, who was Charles Darwin, may ring a bell, he intends to narrow down his investigation to, quote, those expressive manifestations that are spontaneous, automatic, and that, because of the commonalities in human nature, are practically the same in all countries of the world, so much so that they represent a veritable universal language. So you see, once again, an insistence on language. Expressions constitute a multitude of, quote, conventional signs, the meaning of which it is necessary to know, as happens for the words of any language. And it should not come as a total surprise that Mantegazza extrapolates ideologically loaded meanings from such a semiotic system. As for most of his contemporaries, however deeply disturbing and unacceptable to us, and I'm very clear on that, this decipherment of the expressive richness legitimizes a hierarchical conceptualization of subjects according to the parameters of class, race, and gender that elevates or marginalizes the usual suspects. And listen to what he says. The uncouth man expresses immediately all that he feels. The educated man expresses himself with reserve, as he cares about showing that he's always holding the reins of his horses, meaning he's always in command of his behavior and his thoughts. The facial expression of the white man is higher than that of the Negro, term that he uses, and the latter higher than that of the ape, because the facial muscles are more and more distinct in proportion as we rise from the anthropoid ape to the Aryan. This somatic expressive verticality, a blatant synthesis of the 19th century grand narrative of progress, deterministically equivalent to the supremacy of the white, male, European bourgeois subject, finds additional support in the moral and behavioral traits that strengthen the physiognomic polarity between the civilized individual, guess what, the dominator endowed with power and mastery over himself, and his subalterns within or across cultures and ethnicities. Here you see the way in which these hierarchies of races, not even ethnicities, they were really races for the time, have aesthetic implications and intellectual implications. And you may take a look and see who's at the top and who's at the bottom, unfortunately. Considered the subalterns incapable of self-regulation, be it in the case of actions or reactions, rationality or emotionality. Suffice it to consider the following reflections on laughter. First of all, in connection to ethnicity. Laughter, which is pleasant in its early stages, may become so intense, so prolonged, that it turns into a veritable convulsion that the will is unable to dominate. Darwin could verify that this laughter, to the point of tears, happens among the Hindustani, the Chinese, the Malaysian, the Abyssinian, and the indigenous of North America. For my part, Mantegazza adds, I saw it among Negroes of various tribes and in the Indians of South America. Then, in relation to age and gender, children and women laugh more than men and adults because they are more excitable and because there is a much lower moderating force in their cerebral hemisphere. Likewise, mimica, so expression, in woman is very intense, with scanty details in intellectual expressions, but with a wealth of them for manifestations of affection and of pain, as usual. The figure of the woman lower in terms of intellect and much richer in terms of affection. We could characterize female expression with one word, actually more than one, saying that it resembles very much the expression of a child, another very common equation at the time. Other secondary modifications of her expressions derive from woman's muscular weakness and from her overpowering need to be liked and to seduce. Violent movements tire her out and subtract most of her grace. Hence, intense frowns on her face render her ugly and destines her for precocious wrinkles. Mantegazza assumes that, in looking at a face, we note rapidly, by a sort of inner shorthand, here we go with the title, the most expressive and the most characteristic features. We keep this shorthand portrait in our minds, and thanks to it, we distinguish each other, and it suffices us for the ordinary purposes of life. And on this basis of the system of symbolic abbreviations inscribed on the face, he consolidates the triad of savage, woman, and child as others of the Homo Europaeus by assigning specific cultural values to emotions that work not only synchronically, so here and now in his contemporaneity, but also diachronically, meaning across time. Hate, for instance, is, he says, the expression of an extremely powerful human energy that has written more than half of our history, and which, as in Darwin, is connected with atavism, hence to an inferior past with residues that persist in alleged inferior ethnicities or subjects in the society of his time. This collusion of the true, the beautiful, and the good in the construction and preservation of inequalities between categories of individuals are, as you may have noticed, a notorious hallmark of the fin de siècle. But I wish to linger on what, in my view, are less canonical, more transgressive aspects of Mantegazza's engagement with physiognomy and expression, which lead Mantegazza beyond his declared intent. He ends up drawing a different face, a more complex and unsettling physiognomy of his cultural panorama, whenever he foregrounds the multiplicity and variability of expressive manifestations and the role that sensations and emotions play as immanent productions in blurring boundaries. Mimica, so expression, which he defines an extra current of emotion and of thought, is for him centrifugal energy emanating from the nerve centers and challenging classifications. Human faces, he says, are so variable in their relative proportions, in their lines, in their agreements and disagreements, that we may say there are in the world as many faces as there are individuals. And no face was ever repeated twice in the course of centuries. Differences proceed by infinitely small degrees. The extreme poles are united by so many intermediate rings that there is enough to confuse and weary the most penetrating observer and the most skillful classifier. And in this respect, you're not supposed to read all this, but just take a look at the quantity of adjectives that he tries to use to classify even the tiniest differences between one physiognomy and the other, one expression and the other. So you see, his classificatory enterprise begins to be blurred because categories are never enough to contain all the different variations, okay? Also here, for instance, different degrees in these expressions of pleasure and of pain, of love and of hate. And also in this case, different physical manifestations for each of these expressions. To go beyond this, he is so intrigued by the different nuances that he even creates a so-called Atlante, so an atlas of expressions of pain with the support of photography, which was something very new at the time. You know, the use of photography, which began to be used, especially in Italy, as a support for anthropological investigation. And these are some examples. The guy to the left is Mantegazza himself, who is trying to inflict upon himself different degrees of pain and has a photographer take pictures of him at different moments. okay, he was very interested in himself, and at the same time investigating whether other ethnicities have the same way of using muscles and of producing the same expressions under the same conditions. I add this, which for me is very intriguing, okay? A sequence of pictures, they might even seem stills from a film, okay? So you see the infinitesimal differences between one specific expression and the other, because he was precisely intrigued in the passage from one to the other. So once again, physiognomy is not enough to record all these nuances. This comes later. Aware of the efforts required to accommodate what he defines as the thousands responses of the heart and of the mind inscribed on the human face within precise categories, Mantegazza recognizes discrepancies, decentering, expansions that destabilize order and measure. In particular, and I come to another twist in his theory, when he explores sensations and emotions that are morally and intellectually problematic, new, uncontrollable. He shows us that to focus on expression means to give priority to movement and performativity, to living contingent modulations rather than to rigid anatomical traits and interpretive categories. The bodily shorthand becomes essentially not readable, but rather a challenge to signification and knowledge, and to a great extent, this is due to the particular temporal and spatial context in which the individual operates. Mantegazza, and he's not alone, calls the late 19th century il secolo nevrosico, the Neurosic century, another piece of the title. Not nevrotic, it's neurosic, so we are going in the same direction, but it's not so clinical, okay? And it's an adjective that we don't find anymore, but at the time was rather used, to which in 1887 he devotes an entire book with that title, the Neurosic century. His epoch, he says, is wise but not happy, as shown by the high frequency of mental alienation and suicides, one of the many outcomes of what Mantegazza sees as a state of irrationality, of extraordinary excitability, be it temporary or permanent. This irritability, another term he uses, and the disorder and weakness it entails are the response of nerves to the excessive stimulations and actions of a frantic life, an environment of the too much. So already they begin to feel that sensations and the kind of life, also with the Industrial Revolution, which in Italy had just begun, but in Europe was already in full swing, it was too much. And you'll see in a second the intervention of the machine in this perception. The offspring of modern civilization undergoes a veritable anatomic and physiognomic mutation from bios, so from life, to techne, to technology. Instead of legs, man walks with locomotive wheels, Mantegazza says, and instead of the tongue, he speaks with the telegraph and the telephone. Even optic nerves and senses in this sort of bionic individual are affected by a veritable morbid hyperesthesia, okay? So hyperesthesia, excessive stimulations, excessive sensations. So much so that, as he says, neurosic man has not only 5, but 500, 5,000 senses. His nerves, which have all turned into microscopes, telescopes, microphones, and galvanometers, keep him in a constant state of agitation, transforming him into a mirror with 100 faces that collects all that moves above, below, up high, and deep inside. The continuous state of excitation of the Neurosic century, paradoxically both cause and effect, hence requires always new stimulants. Above all, the voluptuous and fanciful intoxication, these are words by Mantegazza, of narcotics and alcoholic beverages. Mantegazza indeed attempts a classificatory operation of drug and alcohol-induced expressions and behavior in numerous of his works, but in so doing, he reveals that the increased physiological and nervous activity caused by the excessive pressure of the Neurosic century is for him, let's say, not only a curse, but also a blessing, in the sense that he likes very much the kinds of sensations produced by them, in line with his proverbial hedonistic inclinations. From his groundbreaking article on the hygienic and medicinal properties of coca and on nervine nourishment in general, 1859, the guy was very precocious, which this article consecrates him as the first to have introduced to Europe the coca plant, not only for medicinal reasons. And his earlier also Physiologia del piacere, so Physiology of Pleasure, 1854, down to subsequent volumes entirely devoted to nervine foods, Mantegazza extols and legitimizes the states of excitation and transgressive experiences beyond equilibrium, measure, and control. As he writes in a work titled Quadri della natura umana, so Pictures of Human Nature, Feasts and Intoxications, 1871, nervine foods greatly contribute to render life much happier. Under their action, our consciousness of existing increases. We mitigate or forget moral sorrows, and we reawaken a happiness that may attain the highest degree of elation. Rather than classifying in order to regulate, biopolitically speaking, Mantegazza designates new terms to introduce these new psychic and emotional states, translating into new temporary, physical, and expressive transformations. For instance, I give you some examples. The highly caffeic nervine elements generate, he says, a special, fleeting, and very noble form of intoxication that I would call caffeica. Okay. It is a sort of convulsive excitability accompanied by a very singular liveliness of sensations, he says, thoughts and movements, which could be accompanied by an irresistible desire to laugh. We see here that the scope is not so much to contain oneself, no, by avoiding this state, but rather to succeed in creating all the conditions that can allow the individual to experience this form of pleasure, all the more precious because it is rare and elitist. Likewise, what he defines as the ebbrezza narcotica, so narcotic intoxication of the coca leaves, is a pleasure, he says, far superior to any other physical ones I have ever known. So much so that he labels the coquero, so the coca user, the happiest man in the world, like a drunkard and the opium eater in a delirious state. Mantegazza even looks for commonalities between the different forms of intoxication, which he ends up grouping under the rubric of ebbrezza baccante, where baccante is inspired precisely by, the bacche, the maenads, the female raving possessed followers of the Greek god Dionysus. This excessive state, he says, lays bare the most obscure parts of man's personality, insofar as, in the tumult that agitates him, memories and hopes, passions and thoughts come to surface, and everything blurs. Here we grasp what the coexistence of rationality and emotionality, thoughts and passions, in a contemporaneity that encompasses past and future alike. This confusion, really a fusion and a confusion of elements that invalidates the parameters of classification, and here I would say not only of physiognomy, but of pathognomy, because it's also a matter of classifying sensations themselves, can be further appreciated when we read that consumption of alcohol even seems to erase all the ethnic and cultural inequalities, which we have seen earlier, on which the positivist evolutionary mentality is founded. Why? Because alcohol for Mantegazza is the most cosmopolitan nervine food, insofar as, he says explicitly, the savage and the most educated man in modern civilization drink alcoholic beverages with the same voluptuousness and for the same reason, because they modify rapidly and deeply the way of feeling and of thinking, because they are among the easiest and most powerful generators of pleasures. His language, of Mantegazza, not of man, less and less scientific and more lyrical, evolves in synchrony with the expansion of his conceptualization of the uses and scopes of the body, visible in the transition from hygiene to morality and ultimately to the search for happiness. Mantegazza essentially resurrects pleasures, elation, jouissance, enhancing them instead of keeping them at bay. Therefore, just as the innumerable expressive instances of mimic, of expression, challenge regularity and univocity, the endless variety of wine, with its 1,000 flavors, embraces, he says, all the notes of gastronomic voluptuousness. Opium, hashish, and at the top, coca, as we have seen, as equally central branches in the tree of happiness, produce the most sublime phantasmagoria, inducing the sweetest buzzing, general disruption, delight, mental overexcitement, and the most spectacular hallucinations, emphasizing precisely the thrill, he says, of feeling intensely alive. We could hence argue that in Mantegazza, expression and the fleeting temperamental outbursts it reproduces are precisely the ground on which the orderly logos of natural sciences abdicates in favor of the obscure object of investigation, if not divination, of psychological empiricism. The body of biopolitics, we have seen, is a disciplined and productive body. In addition to the inner shorthands inscribed on the face and the unruly semiosis of emotions and sensations well exemplified by Mantegazza's thought, it is also the skin that emerges as another canvas and page on which physiognomies of excess challenge biopolitical regimes of knowledge and power. I'm here referring to the second of my three examples, the practice of tattooing, which, in the intriguing cross-fertilization between aesthetic and anthropological elements of the 19th century scientific discourse, undermines what we could say is the sacredness of the body, as much as its use as an object to be mastered according to the norms of material and rational progress. Any of you has a tattoo? Perfect, exactly, you see. So, of course, today tattooing has lost most of its transgressive impact and has entered the era of homologation. I also wanted one, but my parents didn't allow me to, and I was too good to disobey. I still have time, so. It is part of a mass fashion by now, no? Across social classes. But you may know that in the 19th century it was disquieting, although curiously it was quite widespread within the aristocracy, especially the English one. And so maybe in the question and answer period we can elaborate on that. But for the Neurosic century, the time I'm dealing with right now, the negative term of comparison is the predominance of tattooing among so-called savages due to the more impressionable and more childish psychic state of that supposedly backward stage of civilization. We're still going back to progress in just one direction, okay? Which in modern societies, and here is the connection, finds equivalents in allegedly anomalous individuals like neurotics, eccentrics, insane, and criminals. The model for this interpretation of tattooing as a semiotic practice supporting classification of physical, psychic, and moral abnormalities is another Italian guy, Cesare Lombroso, criminal anthropologist and author of a book, maybe you heard of it, very notorious at the time, L'uomo delinquente, Criminal Man, 1876. For Lombroso, the painted skin, far from a simple exotic fashion, is the tangible proof of deviance and inferiority, in a continuum from the aberrant practices of primitive populations to the degenerate behavior of the lowest ranks of modern society. Already in 1863, as a military doctor, Lombroso examined over 1,000 artillerymen and was struck by the fact that 134, not one more, not one less, of them, all from disadvantaged social strata, had indelible images or phrases on their bodies. He took stock of them, as we can see in the various editions of Criminal Man, where he claims that the use of tattooing tends to decrease, he says, among non-criminal men, while it not only persists, but even acquires vaster proportions in the criminal population, both military and civilian. These are some pages from the first edition of his seminal work where he reproduced some of the images that he found on the skin of the people I mentioned earlier. And you'll see that then he evolves. The criminal sciences iconography of the skin lays out different typologies of tattoos dictated, in Lombroso's view, by religious devotion, imitative impulses, revenge, laziness, vanity, eroticism, or mnemotechnics. no matter what, okay? Lombroso grasps the evocative potentiality of tattoos as veritable autobiographies. He deciphers, but he deciphers what he wants, you see. But deciphers the marks on the bodies unilaterally as signs of deviant backwardness, which substantiates his overall theory of atavism. As we read in one of his essays in English, which was circulating more or less, yes, in the years 1896, so he was still editing additional editions of L'Uomo Criminale. This is an article that circulated in the Popular Science Monthly, 1896, titled The Savage Art of Tattooing. I have been told that the fashion of tattooing the arm exists among women of prominence in London society. So here, even women. The taste for this style is not a good indication of the refinement and delicacy of the English ladies. First, it indicates an inferior sensitiveness, for one has to be obtuse to pain to submit to this wholly savage operation without any other object than the gratification of vanity. And it is contrary to progress, so once again, this idea of progress, for all exaggerations of dress are atavistic. Curiously, when he gets to the 5th edition of his seminal study in 1896, he devotes a self-standing atlas, so an entire volume, to the reproduction of more striking images of tattoos to illustrate, as he writes in the preface, for the world of criminals, what ethnographers call the pictography of savages and their aesthetics, their graphology, and their hieroglyphs. This, for him, provides blatant evidence of the existence and features of the type of the born criminal and of the epileptic. And here, when I say type, we talk really about a category, okay? It's not just somebody who occasionally misbehaves, and we'll see why this is important when we get to the third example. Here, the type is a category that he fills in a very deductive way, so in a prescriptive way, and the traits, behavioral traits, moral traits, are, or let's say, have to be, according to him, constant. A criminal anthropologist who denies the type, he says, is as absurd as a physiologist who does not believe in anatomy, or a painter who disavows drawing. So imagine it as a contour, you have to fill it, but you have to fill it according to a series of norms that you have decided in advance, okay? So there is no margin of negotiation. Lombroso is not the only anthropologist who extrapolates an aesthetic, medical, moral, and juridical physiognomy from the practice of tattooing, subjecting it to biopower. Here we have a list of other scientists, Italian and I chose Italian and French ones to give an idea that it was a very common discourse. In his 1881 study, Les Tatouages, Études anthropologiques et médico-légales, Alexandre Lacassagne, who is the main representative of the French School of Criminal Medicine, so a sort of equivalent of Lombroso, treats tattoos as speaking scars, which, beyond a mere folkloric representation of savagery, disclose precious information on the moral ideas of the individual in view of their ultimate medical and judiciary treatment. So biopolitics once again. For his part, in Du Tatouage, Paul Horteloup, so earlier than Lacassagne, concluded that it was necessary to educate individuals to persuade them that, quote, those drawings on the skin, good for barbarians, are a shame for a free man who is conscious of his own dignity. While Ernest Berchon ranks tattooing among the bad habits acquired, he says, in a moment of idleness, forgetfulness, or debauchery. Significantly, these univocal readings of the tattooed body as a text of moral and physical degeneration that needs to be disciplined, punished, and only in the best scenario rehabilitated, turn out to be even more interesting for their unwitting implications against the grain of the positive mindset. They draw, at least according to me, the portrait of an unpractical savage life devoted to what? To aesthetic pursuits as forms of wastefulness and purposelessness in contrast with a utilitarian modern West. It's the moment when the bourgeoisie is essentially obsessed with money. The economic factor is important, is very speculative, and here you have an other, an ethnic other, and some internal others within the European society who waste in the sense of, they devote energy and they use aesthetics as a non-productive activity. In other words, the pathological diversity of the primitive fop type, addicted to physical decoration just for the pleasure of representation for its own sake, not subdued to moral imperatives or rational concerns, inaugurates a transgressive body politics that, through the disinterestedness and self-reflexivity of beauty, indicts the speculative bourgeois ethos and paves the way for an anti-modern counter-discourse that will emerge with a vengeance a few decades later, in the early 20th century, especially in anthropology. And here I'm thinking of Malinowski or Marcel Mauss, among others, and I'll be happy to elaborate during the question and answer period. The third and last challenge to the biopolitical purposes of the late 19th century that I wish to examine is a response to the atomization of collectivity for the purpose of governance. So far, we have seen physiognomy in the service of typification and standardization of man as species, essentially, subverted by what? By eccentric, transgressive, abnormal individualities. There is, however, a follower of Lombroso's who undermines physiognomic regularities and highlights moral and legal gray areas, we could call them this way, traced by the weakening of individual responsibility and the abdication of the will in a crowd setting, yet a crowd conceived not as a flattening sum of individuals, but as a specific physical and psychological entity itself. I'm referring to Scipio Siegele, so an Italian jurist, sociologist, psychologist, who in 1891 published his groundbreaking La folla delinquente, the criminal crowd. If you remember the criminal man, Lombroso, earlier, now we have the crowd. And please take a look at the English cover here, because Professor Hahn is implied here, because this is an edition that we have just finished, and we have a foreword by our illustrious colleague here, so perfect. So not only the title evokes these deviant scenarios that are quite removed from Mantegazza's quest for pleasure, but Siegele does more. He brings to the foreground the negative, disquieting underpinnings of that centrifugal energy of emotions and excesses that escape rational control and social order. He explores the rigid Lombrosian taxonomies and focuses on how temporary impulses can change the physical, moral, and mental physiognomy of individuals assembled in a group. With his investigation of dangerously destabilizing collective behaviors, he crafts an unsettling physiognomy of transgression that offers an inevitable, that is ultimately acceptable. Why do I say this? Because Siegele would not like to see this phenomenon, but he realizes that whether he likes it or not, this is where society is going. And so the crowd is here to stay. Modernity is the age of the crowd. The urban setting is the setting of the crowd. And so even though he would like to discipline and punish the crowd, he realizes that it's not possible, and we'll see why. So acceptable because he has to make virtue of necessity. This is where progress is going. You want progress, progress is going in that direction. So inevitable and ultimately acceptable, this portrait of the social and psychological complexity of his time, and complexity really is in the way of a clear-cut classification. Siegele's crowd, from the couple, which is for him the elementary form of the crowd, two as opposed to one, we are together, okay? From the couple to the multitude, materializes the century-long ancestral fear of the loss on oneself, which by contrast Mantegazza glorifies through the use of nervine foods and the exercise of pleasures. Even more specifically, Siegele shows us that the threat to the scientific attempt to master the human subject, just like any natural element, does not only come from within ourselves, from our imponderable, contingent temperamental outbursts, as in Mantegazza's Mimica, and not simply from the environment conceived in general terms, but in particular from our own fellow human beings who infect and hypnotize us, making us vulnerable, susceptible to the uncontrollable emotions and passions of others, those others who are close to us, and progressively even those who are not in our immediate proximity. Think of social media, what Instagram does. I don't want to sound like, the paternalizing or maternalizing, but this is, Siegel had already intuited this, okay? Even if you're not close by, there can be forms of influences of the group, of the collectivity that changes the individual physiognomy and the physiognomy of the group itself. In Siegel's theory of the criminal crowd, collective behavior trespasses moral and legal boundaries under the dangerous influx of what he calls suggestion. Contrary to the optimistic Mantegazzian portrait of the individual yearning for pleasures and happiness, Siegel's crowd is, as a collective subject, generally more disposed to evil than to good. It has a calamitous effect upon single individuals who, inspired by the good, dare oppose to its influence. He says extraordinary strength of character is necessary in order to resist the excesses of the crowd, and only few succeed because the mob compels them to do wrong. The crowd is incomprehensible because of its unpremeditated organization, as in it, he says, there is no orderly and pre-existent common goal, and it functions as a heterogeneous and transitory human aggregate. Why? Heterogeneous because the crowd is composed of different kinds of individuals, okay? Each individual has a specific individuality, guess what? So we're not talking about a homogenizing, but rather a heterogeneous formation. And transitory because the crowd is formed and then dissolves. And these are two elements that influence a lot the theory that Siegel is trying to propose. Yet Siegel postulates the interventions of something that acts temporarily as a common thought, although it cannot be explained. For instance, a sound, a voice, a cry, what the literature of the time had already labeled the soul of the crowd. And this leads the group to the most horrible excesses by imitation. Bringing in the example of the French Revolution, when the population was a wild beast, he says, insatiable in its thirst for plunder and blood, Siegel doubts that the crowd's violence derived from the awakening of homicidal instincts. So he doubts essentially the validity of the criminal type. There is nothing intrinsically criminal. It's the environment, it's the context that changes the moral physiognomy of the person and of the group. The origin of that extreme collective behavior lies rather in the influence exerted by some corrupt individuals upon the entire group, like madmen and degenerates of every type. And here some Lombrosian terminology echoes. And on account of their psychic weakness, these people are easily driven to excesses. Once a crowd has already reached a high degree of paroxysm, Siegel says it cannot renounce a criminal act. Significantly, however, while the intrinsic brutal wickedness that prompts the isolated born or mad criminal to commit a crime should always receive the maximum punishment, also for Siegel, Siegel is more cautious about a group situation precisely because a man in a crowd can commit murders without being a born criminal. Crime may just be due to a moral intoxication. You see, the language is still that of excesses related to alcoholic or other nervine foods, and only retrospectively does the individual comprehend the entity of his actions, as if, Siegel says, he woke up from a dream. Siegel believes that, quote, every individual draws from nature a certain character that gives intonation and a physiognomy to his behavior. Yet, this is not all. From the power of suggestion of a deranged individual over another, to the escalation of the same process to the multitude because of a contagious chain effect, the phenomenon of suggestion demonstrates for Siegel that, quote, pathology follows the same laws of physiology. So what you do in a normal state is also what happens when you are in an altered state. For this deduction on the psychology of the crowd, he draws and this is interesting, I wanted to include it because it gives you an idea of the eclectic formation of these thinkers. They draw from scientists, they draw from philosophers, from literary people. So to substantiate what he is saying, he draws from the French philosopher Alfred Espinasse, who, listen to this, analyzing how sentinel wasps alert an entire swarm to the presence of danger, explains the communication of emotions to the multitude in terms of a general effervescence through particular physiological conditions enabled by bodily movement and mimicry, which for him means physiognomy, because he claims we do not think only with our brain, but with our entire nervous system. Likewise, French scientist Jean Rambosson, in his Phénomènes nerveux, intellectuels et moraux, leur transmission par contagion, so a nervous, intellectual, and moral phenomenon, their transmission by contagion, and the term is crucial to Siegele, 1883, applies the laws of transformation and transmission of expressive movements to nervous and mental phenomena, claiming that every psychic state corresponds to a cerebral movement translating into physiognomy, expression, behavior, gestures, and propagates spatially even beyond the individual itself. That is, it extends to its own fellow human beings. This is the case of laughter, for instance, yawns, and sorrow. Therefore, brutal instincts for Siegele prevail in the crowd because any emotion felt and shown by an individual is passed on to the multitude. No matter whether this emotion is fury or anger, in an instant the face and attitude of every individual will display that very expression with tense or tragic nuances. Physiognomy records a specific expression because the specific emotion that propelled it is also present. Siegele's underlying analogy here is with individual under hypnosis, who moves through all the states corresponding to the positions commanded of him, and this is as true in big groups guided by the so-called meneur, so the leader of the crowd, the hypnotizer, the suggestionizer, as I have defined it in my English translation, as in what we could call the elementary form of Siegele's criminal crowd, as we saw before, the criminal couple. So the same mechanics happens no matter how big or small the collectivity is. This erratic reaction and intense propagation of emotions in a crowd prompts Siegele to craft a gendered simile which recurs with minimal variations throughout his works. Again, women. The crowd, like woman, has an extreme psychology capable only of excesses, never mediocre or balanced in its sentiments. As politically incorrectly as in his contemporaries, for Siegele, the female subject, who is not accidentally in the process of coming to terms with feminism, and obviously men are fearful, okay? Women are changing, they cannot be subdued anymore. So feminism is a phenomenon that has very unsettling effects on the male subject of the time. So because of that, females exaggerate in both good and evil, being the prey of their extreme temperaments. And when gathered in groups, women for Siegele are the quintessence of barbarism, as they commit excesses much more cruel than male crowds. This speaks volumes, of course, about the intellectual's reticence to accept new female subjects, displaying different emotions, drives, moralities from those attached to the male-produced and male-owned female image. Indeed, in his study, The New Woman, Siegele draws the general lines of female psychology as science traced them, but with the understanding that this portrait does not resemble all physiognomies, insofar as, he says, the moral physiognomy of woman is, like the physical one, of a stunning unpredictability, and in the woman of today, it is impossible to recognize the woman of yesterday. Beyond the blatantly biased lens through which Siegele refracts gender issues, these claims underscore how the richness, contingency, and changeability of experiences can more effectively, or should we say more realistically, render the essence of life than codified, static, partial reproduction of human types. Not accidentally, he employs the term physiognomy more freely than Lombroso, precisely as an exterior description of something that is much more intricate than physicality, and temporary rather than permanent. Ultimately, by now, we could say more psychological than anatomic. If physiognomy and expression are bodily translations of inner impulses, the reading of this corporeal text as textual corpus requires a more sophisticated hermeneutic approach because it is referential reality itself that has become exponentially more complex. The accelerated, convulsive Neurosic century does not erase boundaries only between experiences, but more radically between individuals. Ultimately, to recap and to get to some final thoughts, it is the very meaning of man as homo and individual that expands and becomes more intricate at the turn of the century, certainly much deeper than its visual synthesis offered by physiognomy, and much more ungovernable than biopolitical apparatuses would like. The year 1900, when Mantegazza, Lombroso, and Siècle are still alive and active, sees not only the publication of Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, with its well-known investigation into the unfathomable depths of the unconscious, never fully interpretable, like analysis itself, terminable and interminable, but also of Henri Bergson's Le Rire, so on laughter, where laughter is singled out as the answer to the underlying question of what makes us human, distinguishing us from other living beings and lowering the boundaries within and outside ourselves. Mantegazza, who on the one hand defined anthropology as the natural history of man to be studied like plants and rocks, declares, on the other hand, not feeling pertains to rocks, and I want to be a man. And Siècle recognizes that it is precisely the pressure of strong emotions and sensations that turns the child into a man, although too fast. These excessive experiences underscore an ambivalent human condition, at once subject to a sort of primitive atavistic regression and exposed to a new, modern, enhanced, uninhibited sociability. And all that is inside this individual, hidden, suppressed, buried since earlier eras of non-individuation, is no longer in harmony with what can be read through its facial shorthand. Physiognomy, in its strict literal function of a corresponding analogy still faithful to Lavater's theory, is no longer enough in the Neurosic century. The term increasingly becomes a metaphor that can only be used in the plural to describe a reality always deeper and more extended, multi-layered and ungraspable, a reality that is no longer only physis, only matter, as it is perturbed and enriched by the not seen, not seeable, not tangible, and neither totally knowable, so beyond the nomos, nor translatable, just as 19th century realism and naturalism, which transpose the biological naturalistic perspective of physiognomic representation to the domain of aesthetics, turns out to be too superficial to account for the polyhedric modernist world. As a final twist, much more effectively than the inner shorthand of Mantegazza's physiognomy striving for transparent translation, it is the rhetoric of chemistry, the experimental science of baffling combinations and unforeseeable reactions, that seems to better capture the ambiguity, simultaneity, multiplicity, and incompleteness shaping the individual psyche as much as social interactions. Siècle frequently makes this association in the criminal crowd, just as chemical reactions, and you have the quote here, result in new and different substances, so too the psychological reactions result in new and terrible emotions, unknown to the human soul until that moment. His essay against parliamentarism will foreground, and you have the entire quote in the second one, the very complicated laws of chemistry that govern the human psyche, even in political contexts, leading to always surprising and often unexplainable phenomena, which are called combinations and fermentations. Mantegazza, too, trusts in the unexhausted magic and magical surprises of science to conceive a future with no inhibitions, and rather with enhanced opportunities for hedonistic experiences. and chemistry is central to his prophetic vision as a powerful replacement of nature. And this is the quote that I'm reading now. In a few centuries, Mantegazza always likes to see ahead, a lot ahead, centuries and centuries or millennia ahead of him. Even the richness of nature will be such a small thing compared to the numberless ethers that chemistry will be able to fabricate for us. And each of them, in its own way, will intoxicate our nerves, so greedy for sensations, and will hence make ourselves, so thirsty for thought, think differently and multifariously. With his far-sighted projection towards dimensions, substances, and periods still to come, in which nature and organic matter will not suffice, Mantegazza hence gives us a glimpse of a new augmented reality and physicality, not only shaped by mystery, but also modified by the intervention of the synthetic. Yet, this already sounds like another story and another physiognomy, much closer to us, the story and the physiognomy of our own equally neurosic and interconnected, but not necessarily sociable, and definitely more artificial and virtual third millennium, where the human, shifting from the fascinating object of inquiry of anthropology to the pernicious and derealized protagonist of the Anthropocene, is at serious risk of extinction rather than on the exhilarating wave of expansion. Thank you.